Trump team's commentary on Ukraine, I think we're starting to see the grown-ups in his team change, and a change of what they're saying and the way they're saying it compared to what they were doing during the presidential campaign. And I can see Trump coming in and potentially giving Zelensky an awful lot more support than he's had beforehand from a military perspective, so that he can hurt the Russians very hard indeed and try and force Putin to the negotiating table. Trump's relationship with China is fascinating. It's not good. We bankrupted the USSR by producing better technology faster, so that they had to counter the threat from that technology, because it was military technology, by spending even more. And that got to the point where it bankrupted the USSR. I think Trump sees that tactic, and I can see him trying that tactic against China. The one thing that world leaders don't like about him is he's unpredictable. And in diplomacy terms, global leaders don't like unpredictability in any way, shape or form. He's keeping global leaders on their toes. And that unpredictability and them on their toes means they don't know where to go and can't plan. So he can potentially outmaneuver them.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Trump's inauguration is barreling towards us, and his team face a long list of challenges on the world stage. But how are world leaders likely to react to this new administration? Joining us today is Philip Ingram, military intelligence expert and commentator on all things global security. Philip, welcome.
Nice to be here.
At least here in Europe, a lot of eyes are going to be over on the Kremlin rather than Washington and Kiev. Trump says he wants to end the war before day one. His team are now admitting that might take months instead. Where is the Trump team on their approach to Russia?
The Trump team's approach to Russia is very interesting indeed. We've seen this change in the commentary going from we're going to end the war on day one, so Tuesday next week there'll be no more war in Europe. Nobody ever expected that to happen. To they've been now talking about 100 days afterwards. I've seen some commentary on that. That in political terms and domestic political terms, the United States, Trump, there's always a lot of commentary around what has the president achieved in his first 100 days. And we see this in the UK. What has the prime minister and the new government achieved in its first 100 days? So I think that's an arbitrary target that they've put in. And again, once Trump's in, which is lunchtime on Monday, he's got 4.5 years. So it doesn't really matter if he keeps changing this. And the Trump team's commentary on Ukraine, I think we're starting to see the grown-ups in his team change, and a change of what they're saying and the way they're saying it compared to what they were doing during the presidential campaign. Because, of course, all the commentary during the campaign was aimed at the US domestic audience, not the international community. But the international community, having seen Trump beforehand as president and the threats that he's put in, have put 2 and 2 together and come up with it. The answer must be 7.5 because it's Trump. And that's what's causing a lot of angst around global leaders at the moment.
So where's Putin going to sit on this? How are these two big egos, in a way, of the world stage going to interact with each other?
There's no doubt that Putin and Trump have got some form of special relationship. When Trump was president beforehand, for him to have sat for 45 minutes or longer on a one-on-one with Putin, with no interpreters, no note takers, nothing, is unheard of. It is, it's not there. Trump's business interests before he started to get into politics in Russia, especially with his Miss World and Miss Universe contests and all the rest of it, and hosted in Moscow, and his real estate business interests into Russia and elsewhere. There are links there. You do not have business in Russia unless you're linked into the wider oligarch network, and that oligarch network, the oligarch in chief, is Vladimir Putin. So there's something there, and we don't know what that is, and we don't know how much influence that has. However, there's an indication to suggest that that influence has got a different understanding in Putin's eyes compared to Trump's eyes. And Trump, I think, is feeling a little bit more confident about what's going on, because we had the post-election Trump and his team putting threats out to different world leaders. He's talked to Zelensky. Zelensky's come up with a peace plan and a road to the end of the conflict. He talked to Putin's team. Putin's team, through his spokesperson, Peskov, denied that there'd been a conversation. However, I think that there was a conversation and it didn't go the way Putin wanted. Because what we saw 24 hours later was naked pictures of Melania Trump being plastered all over Russian national television, which is a classic Russian intelligence officer's approach to having been through an awkward conversation that didn't go the way you expected it to turn around and say, right, I'm going to threaten you. And if he's putting that out, and that was very personally focused against Donald Trump, if he's doing that, that doesn't bode well for the Trump-Putin relationship. So we'll see how that goes.
Obviously, as you say, Zelensky's been speaking with Trump. He's been on something of a charm offensive, really, since the summer to make that case for continued support for Ukraine from Trump. Has it worked?
I don't think there was a danger of the support not being there beforehand, because I think when we look at the way commentary has come out, especially from Trump's B team, some of those that are new individuals going into high office, who haven't got the experience. And I call them B team, but through lack of experience rather than necessarily lack of ability, because we haven't seen how capable they are. They've come out with very strong statements saying we shouldn't be wasting US taxpayers' dollar and supporting Ukraine. We're going to cut that out immediately and all that. But these are all sound bites. These are all soundbite headlines. And that was aimed at domestic political audience in the run up to the election. If you look at those that are slightly more experienced and where they came out with, when you look at the headline is similar, but actually you look at the substance, and the substance was because of the party's approach and Joe Biden's approach to giving unlimited money, unlimited support without a clear plan to end the conflict and to an end state. Trump's going to come in with a plan to an end state. Zelensky's picked up on that language and the difference that's there and has presented Trump with a plan to an end state so his team can sit and go, oh, well, we've got the plan. We've got the plan. We'll continue the investment. Trump and Trump's team are going to get into a position where they're either, they're banging Putin and Zelensky's heads together, and they're saying you both need to compromise, which is what you have to do when you negotiate. Zelensky is showing a compromising attitude and a compromising plan. Putin's not. Putin's being more aggressive, and Putin's saying, my compromise is I want more. I'll take more. You give me more. There'll be no concessions to Ukraine. Trump's not going to take that. He's a businessman. He'll want both sides to give. And if Putin doesn't give, Trump will then come down and say, well, okay, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to force you to give. And I can see Trump coming in and potentially giving Zelensky an awful lot more support than he's had beforehand from a military perspective, so that he can hurt the Russians very hard indeed and try and force Putin to the negotiating table.
And on some of the proposals from Trump's team, mixed messages from the new administration. They don't seem to want Ukraine in NATO, but they do seem to want Ukrainian boots on the ground in Ukraine. That seems like it's not going to please either side. Can Trump get that sort of deal through still, do you think?
I think there's an awful lot of testing the water with statements that are coming out, as we see in any political campaign. Governments are great at throwing out an idea and it gets into the press and it gets debated in the press, and they sit back and they watch how the debate goes and goes, okay, right, and then they refine the ideas before it's formally put out in any way. It's the same with Trump's team that's coming in, and they're putting it out. It's interesting to see the reaction of some of the global leaders, and we've got Keir Starmer has just gone into Ukraine and signed this 100-year security agreement. We've got Starmer and Francois Macron talking about British and French troops on the ground. We've heard talk of where people describe them as NATO troops, but it could be an alliance, a coalition of allies putting troops on the ground to do everything from secure part of Ukraine through to just providing the training capabilities that are being done inside France and inside the UK and all the rest from a multinational basis, but rebasing that back into Ukraine. There are challenges that come with it. There are advantages and disadvantages that come with all of that. But again, I think a lot of this is being tested out into in the public domain before decisions are made. And again, the way we're seeing Macron and Starmer act, I think is showing that they're taking any behind closed doors chats they've had with Trump's team already quite seriously, because they're trying to play into the hands of saying, we are going to do more, and we're providing a lot more support, so we don't get the wrath of Trump coming in and threatening, as he did last time, to withdraw from NATO or not fulfill his Article 5 commitments, where if you don't pay, we don't play.
Yeah, I mean, as you've said, whether you agree with him or not, it's fair to say that Trump has caused really a bit of chaos for NATO. Yeah. He's doubled down on that 2.5 pledge that some have been calling for. I think he's now saying 5% from NATO for military spending from all the partners. Does NATO need that Trump-style tough love?
Oh, yes, very much so. When he was president beforehand, there were only a few nations that got to the 2% of GDP spent on defence. That is part of what every nation has signed up to by being part of NATO. And whenever he turned around and said, if you don't pay, we don't play, a lot of countries then increased their defence budget and increased their defence spending to get up to that 2%. 2.5% has been an ambition, and we've seen the new Secretary General of NATO talk about 2.5%. Clearly, he's been talking to Trump's team in the background. Trump has come out and said 5%. The US are only spending 3.2% approximately on of their GDP on defence. Now that's still $990 billion, significantly more than any other country around the world. But again, with their defence budget, they're not just Atlantic focused, they're also Pacific focused, and that's probably their big of it. So their defence budget is split in two different ways. So in the North Atlantic, they're not spending 2% of their GDP on what they're doing there, and of course they're seen as a global policeman. So I think Trump, by throwing 5% out, is he approaches things from a business perspective. So he's getting everyone panicking. He's getting all the chancellors of the exchequers and the finance ministers around Europe and elsewhere really panicking about it, and he's going to roll back to 3% or 2.5%, and everyone will just go, oh, that wasn't as bad as we thought, which is a standard business approach. We should expect Trump to do that sort of thing.
The news agenda this week really has been dominated less by Europe and more by the Middle East, Israel. Yeah. The theory that Trump had given Netanyahu until inauguration to bring the Gaza conflict to a close. Maybe that's given more credence now. But the ceasefire isn't actually over the line, is it? Is this a success yet for Trump on the world stage?
Yeah, well, I think this morning, when we're recording this on Friday, the Israeli government have just ratified the agreement. So the first stage, the first 42 days, I think, is over the line and will happen. So what we'll see is 33 Israeli hostages being released for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners being released from Israeli jail. It's upsetting the Israeli government and the extreme elements of the Israeli government, and it's causing destabilization in there. It's a long way before we then get into phase 2 and beyond, which is why Hamas recognize that, which is why Hamas are doing everything to keep some of the hostages. And when 33 are released, that will leave another 64 hostages, I think, still being held, of which the consensus is probably 30 plus of them have died. But it's the hostages and the bodies that they want released. The Israelis, this is in the Israeli psyche really, really important. But it's something, be under no illusion, Trump is very much on Israel's side, very much anti-Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, and anything that has got Iranian influence into it. So he sent some very, very clear messages, and that's why this deal has been signed now. Whether it's going to last or not, I think there's an awful lot of hope out there. I don't think there's a lot of substance, so I'm not confident. I hope it does, but I'm not confident it will.
And I'd like to come on to Iran in a moment, but what are your thoughts then on that ceasefire? Where do we think that is? Is that going to hold, or what are the weaknesses we can see in it today?
I think we'll see it generally holding. We look at the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel in southern Lebanon. And there have been exchanges in different places and accusations across the board of Israel breaking the ceasefire, and Israel said we only broke the ceasefire because we were attacked by Hezbollah. The same thing is going to happen inside Gaza. So as Israel starts to withdraw from places, they will opportunistically see Hamas command and control structures being exposed, or other Hamas leaders being exposed, and they're in that temptation piece as to whether they destroy a threat that they know is going to come back and bite them later, and take the hit for they've broken the ceasefire agreement, but they can ride that wrath, or whether they ignore it. I can see exchanges happening on both sides, because Hamas are going to turn around and go, well, we've got an opportunity here to stimulate the Israelis to attack us, and we are dominating the information domain from an international perspective. So when we accuse them of breaking the ceasefire agreement, everyone's going to believe us first and foremost. So it's too good an opportunity for Hamas not to stimulate the Israelis to have to react, and therefore there'll be tit for tat. The 42-day peace, I think, phase one will happen roughly to what's been agreed. I don't think there's much chance of us getting beyond the phase one.
Iran, it's been in Trump's sights for some time. It's already been notably weakened by the loss of proxy forces such as Hezbollah, allied forces in Syria. Is Trump likely to kind of strike while the iron's hot here, or is he going to leave Iran to lick their wounds?
No, I think Trump is going to continue to strike. He was very good at saying during his election campaign that there were no new wars whenever he was president. But actually, if you take the no new wars and look at the number of attacks that went on, and attacks in particular by drones and assassinations, some of them were Iranian commanders, there were more than under any other president. So, Trump is very good at spinning things. Tell me a politician who isn't, whenever they get to that level. But he's very good at spinning things. And therefore, I think he's going to take the opportunity to further weaken Iran and remove it as a threat. Where does he see the biggest threats coming in from Iran? Their potential to gain nuclear military capability. And therefore, he disagreed completely with the nuclear agreements that have been put into place with Iran, and has tried to undermine that. I can see him setting the conditions to attack Iranian nuclear facilities, and I can see him further trying to degrade the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps and their Quds force in particular, to try and stimulate an opportunity for further political destabilization in Iran, and potentially the overthrow of the religious lead, to get Iran back to where it was at the times of the Shah.
In a first, China is sending its vice president to Donald Trump's inauguration on Monday. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they're warning of a response if Trump resumes his tariff war. Where's Trump going to go with China? Long-term, big topic for him.
Hey, we're going through the top Trumps today. It's great. Trump's relationship with China is fascinating. It's not good. Now, it's not good because China's ambition is to become the largest economy in the world. The United States is the current largest economy in the world. Trump is a businessman. He wants to maintain that position. So first and foremost, we've got a business rivalry going between the two. And Trump is extremely concerned that China is growing its economy by stealing intellectual property from American companies, by influencing and stealing data from American companies, and trying to influence America's ability to carry out free trade around the world. And therefore, we are going to see, I think, a trade war between China and the United States. China recognizes that, but what they're trying to do is take the sting out of it as much as possible. And Trump's team is trying to take the sting out of it, so that any build up to a trade war, there can be as much negotiation going on beforehand, so that a trade war doesn't turn into a shooting war. Because you have to remember, military action is merely an arm of diplomacy. Whenever normal diplomatic efforts fail, and you try to set the conditions to get back to normal diplomatic efforts, that's when military capability is used. It's not something in isolation. It's not something that there has to be a big war, you then use military capability. China is using its military build-up, military capability to influence its economic hold over Taiwan, and the economic links from Taiwan out to the rest of the world. It's doing the same with the Philippines. It's doing the same with Vietnam. It's doing the same with Korea. It's doing the same with Japan. So all the diplomatic levers are going to be used, and some of those will include military. The difficulty is whenever the diplomatic negotiations stop or become more difficult, the potential for the military to get involved in a way that could then stimulate something bigger is increased. And that's what I think both sides recognise.
And you mentioned Taiwan there and other key players in the Southeast Asia region. Does Trump being an enemy of China bring them closer to the US? Where's his position going to be on some of those other regions, on some of those other countries?
Yeah, I think the big issue is Taiwan. That hits the headlines, but we've also got the Paracel and Spratly Islands. We've got the Vietnamese influence into them. We've got the Philippines influence in them. We've got the Chinese Coast Guard putting a lot of effort into trying to push the Philippines away from islands that China wants to have influence over. It's got no legal call over them whatsoever. They're in Philippines territorial waters, but it's the whole region, because there are natural resources under the islands, they think, and it's one of the biggest trade routes in the world. So China wants total influence over all of that, and China's building artificial islands that then have a geographic area around them that is Chinese territory and Chinese maritime territory. And they're putting military bases on them, so they're effectively building permanent aircraft carriers through the region. So there's a massive growth area. It is a huge flashpoint, and China is being very aggressive in its actions around the flashpoint, which is why it's no accident that Trump has pivoted his priority from Europe and from the Middle East to Southeast Asia as being the main priority economically, but also militarily for the US. European nations recognise that. NATO has turned around and made a statement to say that Southeast Asia is within NATO's AOR to influence, and that's why we're seeing HMS Prince of Wales and its carrier battle group going down into Southeast Asia. That's why the French aircraft carrier is heading that direction. The Italian aircraft carrier is heading that direction, because European nations are trying to say to the Americans, hey, look, we're here to help, and try and influence what's going on, so that they can then call on US support into Europe and US support elsewhere. It's beginning to join everything together. That's the worrying bit. China will be watching very closely with regard to any negotiations that are going on in Ukraine. And if Ukraine is forced to give up any territory, then Xi Jinping will decide whether he can suffer the wrath of the international community if he takes Taiwan by force for a period of time. And we're only 3 years into that. So can he suffer that for 3 years? He's already stockpiling oil, gas, natural resources, food, building big warehouses, building shelters. He's preparing for a large war. Doesn't mean to say he's going to carry it out. He's increasing his military build-up enormously, and including power projection, the ability to take a military force somewhere to do something outside China. He's preparing for it. Doesn't necessarily mean to say it's going to happen, because it takes years and years and years to prepare for it. But it's worrying. It's a worrying trend. Trump sees that. Trump also sees an opportunity with regard to the Chinese economy, because yes, it's a fast-growing economy, but it's one which is built on some flaky underpinnings in effectively the real estate market, the property market, and other areas, and Trump will see that. But he also sees Chinese expansionism through the Belt and Road Initiative and through the stands, China's influence over Africa, and he's really worried, I think, about the Chinese influence up into South America and moving up into Central America and knocking on the back door of the United States. And therefore Trump will try and do anything he can to undermine China from an economic perspective. Let's hope that's purely through diplomacy and economic measures rather than through military measures. But of course, we have to remember that the Cold War between the West and Russia was won economically. We bankrupted the USSR by producing better technology faster, so that they had to counter the threat from that technology, because it was military technology, by spending even more. And that got to the point where it bankrupted the USSR. I think Trump sees that tactic, and I can see him trying that tactic against China.
And in the same region, let's talk North Korea. Can we discuss where Trump left off with Kim Jong-un in his last administration? There were these warm words between the two, some sort of admiration almost, but ultimately the North Korean ballistic missile program continued and accelerated. Mm-hmm. Is he likely to go back to that and have another go at stopping Kim Jong-un?
I think he will. North Korea, there are two primary influences into North Korea. China, first and foremost. Historically, it's been there for a long time. Of course, during the Korean War, the Chinese came in and helped the North Koreans. But also Russia, increasing capability in Russia. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of North Korean missile technology individuals speak with a Russian accent. Whether it's Korean with a Russian accent or whether anything else, it wouldn't surprise me if that happened at all. And we're now seeing North Korea and this defense agreement between North Korea and Putin supplying personnel, equipment, ammunition and lots more into Russia. So very close link there. When it comes to internet connectivity, two pipelines go in, a relatively low bandwidth one through Beijing that the Chinese control, and a very high bandwidth link in through Moscow, provided by the Russian National Railway organization that's completely owned by the Kremlin. And therefore, North Korea, I think, for both China and Russia, has been seen as this, in cyber terms, as this plausibly deniable little bad boy that they can go and use to do some activity on their behalf, but it's got North Korean signature all over everything. They can deny any knowledge of it. We're seeing an increasing use of North Korea from a military influence perspective, and Russia seems to be controlling that more than China does. China will be trying to keep control over it so it doesn't go too mad. But I think if we saw an increase threat from a military perspective and a joining together of different conflicts, I think we could see North Korea being used to try and create instability elsewhere. So potentially rockets on Japan, rockets into the Philippines, rockets into South Korea or other areas, to refocus military and diplomatic effort on different things, whilst there's other activities happening, whether it be in Europe or whether it be in Taiwan or whether it be somewhere else. So North Korea is something that we have to watch very closely indeed. But I see Kim Jong-un really as a tool of both Xi Jinping, but increasingly Vladimir Putin.
Do you think we might see another Trump visit to the region then, or is he?
No,
is he
I think Trump will go and see Kim Jong Un, because what Trump will want to do is to be able to get a feel for that, and if his intelligence agencies are saying this is how it's building up, to be able to go directly and say, look, you really, really don't want to do this. Now, here, have another Rolls Royce or have something else, but recognise that the next one that comes in will be delivered by missile, and a very big missile, and the ability to threaten in the way that Trump likes to do.
Well, closer to home, Panama, of all places, has fallen into Trump's crosshairs. I mean, is this a return to manifest destiny, or is there a genuine security concern here?
There's a genuine security concern, and again, it ties in with China and China's influence and China's growth in the Belt and Road Initiative into South America, and it's seeping through very slowly. It's like water permeating through the bricks in a building and slowly flooding it and everything else. The history of the Panama Canal. The US took over the building of the canal from France whenever France couldn't afford to do it. Finished the canal. The largest percentage of ships that go through are US ships, and working through it. The US owned it for a long period of time. There were fights between United States and Panama over control of it, but it was physical US territory. In the same way in UK we've got sovereign territory in Cyprus and in Gibraltar and elsewhere. But it was in the late 1980s that the US ceded control and ownership of it to the Panamanians. That didn't go well whenever Noriega came in as the president of Panama, and the US reinvaded and captured it again because they didn't want someone with communist leanings controlling the Panama Canal, given its influence on US trade. Where Trump's coming from at the moment is that there's an increasing amount of Chinese influence into the Panama Canal. And in particular, we've got Baliba port and Cristobal port. Baliba on the Pacific side, Cristobal on the Atlantic side, are both being run by Hong Kong-owned companies. And the Chinese influence into them is huge. And there's a large influx of Chinese coming in across the canal region. The United States is also paying increasing tariffs because the transit fees going through the canal have gone up. And Trump's view from a business perspective is, hey, we used to own this. We used to get this for free. We didn't have this Chinese influence that there is in here. There's now the Chinese influence, which I'm concerned about, but I'm also having to pay more for US goods to go through, and that's going to cost the US taxpayer more. So that's why the Panama Canal is in Trump's sights, I think.
And Trump's making similar claims about Greenland and Chinese influence there. But is he actually really onto something there about NATO's Arctic security concerns?
Again, I think yes. And this is where, I was not a Trump fan. 6 months ago, I would have been very anti anything Trump was saying. But actually, you look at the substance behind what's going on. He's got some very clever advisors that are talking through things. Two things about the Arctic. Greenland, the United States has got a military base in Greenland. Pitofik space base is a radar site monitoring, they say, satellites in space. It's part of its early warning network. It can monitor ballistic missiles, and if you monitor satellites, you can monitor multiple re-entry vehicles from nuclear missiles and where they're likely to come down. It's part of that. It's a joint base, US, Canada, Denmark, about 130 civilians, but 120, 130 military, about 450 civilians work in it. But it's a radar site. Trump wants greater security control over Greenland's waters, and it's the waters. It's the passage rights up in through the northern routes through the Arctic for shipping, because Greenland covers a large part of that area. Denmark does not have the ability militarily to provide the support there, and of course the other country that influences it most is Canada. And Canada is one of those countries that's in Trump's sights as well, because Canada only spends 1.37% of its GDP on defence. It's a NATO member. It's a Five Eyes member as well. So Five Eyes, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK and the United States, of course. And Canada's plan on defence was to get up to about 1.76% by 2030. It's not even hitting the 2% that's required. So Trump will be really angry at that. And it can't protect those northern sea routes. Those northern sea routes are as important as the Panama Canal for Pacific Atlantic shipping, and therefore from an international trade perspective. And there's a race between China and Russia to try and grab influence over those areas, and Trump will want to make sure that they're not in a position to do that, and the United States is, because it's vital for the United States trade. A lot of everything that Trump is doing and what he's saying, everyone hears it as military threats. It's not. He's looking after the United States from an economic perspective, and he will not be afraid to use the military as an arm of diplomacy when it comes to gaining economic advantage.
And Philip, I mean, we've gone pretty much all the way around the globe at this point, but perhaps most importantly, where does this leave the US? In geostrategic debate and international relations, there's constantly been this idea of the US as the global hegemon. It leads the international system as we know it today. Is that status secure under Trump?
I think it is. I think we'll see a massive increase in defence spending in the United States, and therefore the military capability will grow. It didn't under Joe Biden. It did under Trump before that. The US will want to assert that position, primarily because there's the status of it. But secondly, it's the economic influence that it has as well. And Trump will be driven by the economic influence. And that's why he's not going to stop supporting Ukraine, because that's the billions of dollars is not being sent to Zelensky. It's being spent in US defense manufacturers to manufacture more ammunition. That's creating more jobs. That's creating more tax dollars going in. It's creating more supporting industry. It's creating more training requirements and education requirements. So it's building the US economy. He's going to want to continue to do that. And he will want to make sure that the US's position as number one in the globe is secure, because that will secure his domestic support much more and give him what he can use to invest in domestic issues. Trump's not daft. 6 months ago, I'd have said he was. But I hadn't read the detail properly. I don't like him as an individual. I don't like a lot of what he stands for as an individual. But actually, from a political perspective, he's very interesting indeed. And the one thing that world leaders don't like about him is he's unpredictable. And in diplomacy terms, global leaders don't like unpredictability in any way, shape or form. He's keeping global leaders on their toes. And that unpredictability and them on their toes means they don't know where to go and can't plan. So he can potentially outmaneuver them, which is what he will try and do more and more.
Philip Ingram, thank you very much for joining us today on the Trump Report.
Thank you very much indeed.